immigration crisis. At every turn, radical Democratic policies either created the issue or actively impeded the solution, or both. Everyday Americans drafted House Republicans to protect them from these harmful policies and provide a check on the White House. This is a duty the majority takes very seriously. Indeed, that's why we're meeting today. Sometimes it seems that President Biden can't even put a sentence together, but the administrative state we're assured that he oversees continues to churn out reckless left-wing policies. What's more, his presidency still emboldens his enablers. Together, their agenda imperils everything from the sanctity of the vote and Title IX to the availability of effective and affordable home appliances. In keeping with what we were hired to do, House Republicans are advancing measures meant to protect our country from the rash and untimely destructive policies of the left. President Biden welcomed an invasion at the southern border. From his rhetoric to the over 60 destabilizing executive actions he has taken since he took office, every corner of the world took him up on the opportunity to enter our nation illegally. The numbers don't lie. Since the president entered office, there have been more than 9 million illegal immigrant encounters nationwide. That doesn't include the almost 2 million known gotaways who evaded apprehension on President Biden's watch, more than the previous decade combined. For context, May marked the 39th straight month where monthly illegal encounters were higher than even the highest single month in the Trump administration. To add insult to injury, President Biden released nearly 5 million illegals into the country and is openly talking about a plan to reward their fellow lawbreakers with amnesty. His choices are shameful, but not surprising. What is surprising is how fervently his surrogates and supporters dismiss concerns over illegal immigrants circumventing the letter of the law and corrupting our democratic process. The president and his enablers have been asking Americans to reject the evidence before their very eyes a lot. And this one is no different. And the evidence that non-citizens register to vote and illegally cast ballots in federal elections is substantial. The National Voting Rights Act, enacted in 1993, requires states to provide a federal voter registration form at the time an individual applies for a driver's license or for state benefits. In some states, non-citizens, including illegal immigrants, are eligible to receive their driver's license and public assistance, meaning non-citizens have undoubtedly been provided voter registration forms in these states, and they've been registering. For example, Pennsylvania admitted just a few years ago that it had inadvertently allowed over 10,000 non-citizens to register to vote, and a Georgia audit found that more than 1,600 non-citizens had attempted to register. Alarmingly, this doesn't stop at registrations. In 2011, Fairfax County, Virginia, discovered over 278 non-citizens on the voter roll and learned that 117 of them had actually illegally voted in Virginia elections. Additionally, over the past decade, several different Arizona counties reported finding hundreds of non-citizens on the voter rolls and determined that some of them illegally voted in federal elections. The SAVE Act, introduced by our colleague on the Rules Committee, Chip Roy, closes the loophole that created by the National Voting Rights Act and supercharged by the left-wing sanctuary policies. It requires a proof of U.S. citizenship to register an individual to vote in elections for federal office. Anyone who believes in safeguarding our democratic processes from illegal foreign influences should vote in favor of H.R. 8281. This administration's radicalism also threatens Title IX, which has protected women and girls' access to educational opportunities for more than 51 years. In April, the White House released an unlawful Title IX rule that, 1, ignores a Supreme Court ruling, and 2, strips students and educators of their rights, and finally enshrines in the law the left's ongoing war against parents. Since Title IX's enactment, female participation in high school sports has grown more than 1,000%, and collegiate sports more than 600%. Their radical actions threaten this progress. Unlike the White House, House Republicans believe that women should be safe in intimate spaces and men should not compete in women's sports. It's why we're advancing H.J. Res. 165, which prevents the administration's radical gender ideology from infiltrating education and hijacking Title IX. Thanks to the Biden administration, the left's radical whims are also poised to infiltrate everyday American homes. The Department of Energy's new dishwasher efficiency standards would take more than 12 years for the proposed efficiency upgrades to break even and would save Americans just $1.12 per year. Consumers understand what options work best for their households, and Washington shouldn't stand in the way of their appliance. Finally, the committee will consider H.R. 8772, the fiscal year 25 legislative branch appropriations bill. I anticipate my friend, the ranking member, will strongly disagree with my contextualization of today's meeting. I hope he will at least echo his fellow Democrats in the committee report and take no issue with the funding levels within the measure. The legislative branch subcommittee delivered a robust $5.5 billion package that supports Congress and our ability to work on behalf of the American people. With that, I look forward to the testimony from our panels, and I welcome the opportunity to move important legislation to the House floor. And I would now ask our ranking member, Mr. McGovern, for any remarks that he wishes to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before we begin, I too want to extend my sincerest condolences to our colleague, Mr. Massey, on the passing of his beloved wife, Rhonda. We are so sorry for his loss, and we're thinking of him and his family during this difficult time. It's a terrible tragedy, and anyway, he'll be in our thoughts and prayers as well as his family. And I too, will keep in my prayers as well the members and their constituencies who are dealing with these terrible storms that have now hit our country, and hope that they get through all of this get through it safely. And now on to the legislation that we're going to be considering here today. You're absolutely right. I disagree with everything you said, and even more strongly than I usually do. This committee should be a place where we debate big ideas, where we tackle important challenges and make real progress. But under the Republican majority, we've done the exact opposite. And this week's measures are no different. We have another funding bill that goes after the LGBTQ community, attacks dreamers, and will make Congress less reflective of the people we represent. We have another thinly veiled attempt at voter suppression under the guise of preventing voter fraud. Even though we all know the voter fraud that my Republican friends are talking about is just shorthand for the big lie that Trump pushed when he tried to illegally steal the election after he lost it fair and square. We all know what's going on here. Republicans do better in elections when fewer people vote, so they want to make it harder for people to actually be able to vote. Look at who this bill would disproportionately impact. People who change their name when they get married, including millions of women. People who can't afford to take a day off from work to go down to the town clerk and get a copy of their birth certificate. People who don't have $130 to get a passport. This isn't about making our elections more secure. It's about making it harder to vote. That is what this bill is aimed at doing. Now, we know what's going on here. Republicans are laying the groundwork for them to discredit the upcoming election. If they win, you'll never hear about this until the next election. But if they lose, they will say it is because of voter fraud. Voter fraud, which, by the way, the Heritage Foundation, that right-wing think tank that you guys always associate yourself with, they can only find 24 cases of it in the last 20 years. They say this is about protecting the right of citizens to vote. For every case of real voter fraud, they want to take away the votes of millions of actual citizens. What a disgrace. We have another effort to make it easier to discriminate on campus, turning back the clock on civil rights because House Republicans continue to prioritize radical culture wars. And just days after July 4th, a day we celebrate actual freedom from tyranny, Republicans have brought up bills about freedom for refrigerators and dishwashers. I mean, you really can't make this stuff up. They have no problem taking away the rights of living, breathing human beings, no problem depriving women of their reproductive rights, stripping away freedom from the LGBTQ community, hindering families who want IVF. None of those groups deserve freedom, according to the Republicans. But refrigerators, sign them up. Apparently, nothing says freedom to them quite like forcing their constituents to pay more on their electric bills. For the record, if somebody wants to keep a 50-year-old refrigerator, that's their right. Nobody's going to stop them. That's nuts. And it's not what this bill is about. This is about Republicans giving billion-dollar companies the freedom to cut corners when they make appliances, keeping all of our utility bills high and polluting the air and water while they're at it. I mean, that's what they are in favor of. But, Mr. Chairman, at the end of the day, it's not just about the legislation here. It's about two competing visions for America. Democrats want an economy that lifts people up. We're fighting for workers. We want opportunity for kids, success for families, and dignity for seniors. We want democracy to be secure at home and around the world. We have a vision of a better future and an idea of how to get there. And these bills before our committee today once again show that Republicans are more interested in division and taking us backwards and turning the clock back. On reproductive freedom, on voting rights, on lowering prices, on holding big corporations accountable, on all these things and more, they want to drag us back. That's what their party now stands for, and that's why we're wasting time with more misguided MAGA junk instead of working together to get things done for the American people. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The chair thanks the gentleman for his comments. Without objection, any prepared statements that our witnesses may have will be included in the record. I do want to call up our first panel, Chairman Brian Steele and Ranking Member Joe Morelli from the Committee on House Administration. And Chairman Steele, I welcome your testimony.
Chairman Burgess, Ranking Member McGovern, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify in support of H.R. 8281, the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, known as the SAVE Act. I'd like to thank my colleague, Congressman Chip Roy, for his sponsorship of this bill and his collaboration in working to get this legislation in final form. I'd also like to thank Speaker Johnson, his team, and our committee staff for all the time and resources dedicating to bringing this bill to life. As chairman of the Committee on House Administration, I've been diligently focused on elections. Our committee's introduced over 50 pieces of legislation and marked up 15 elections bills. We've held 12 hearings, heard from 60 witnesses, and even held a field hearing in Georgia to hear from Americans directly on what is going right and what their concerns are about our election system. We've raised awareness on private election funding, commonly known as Zuckerbucks, and its potential to influence our elections administration. We've passed legislation to close a loophole that allows foreign nationals to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to influence American elections. As a House, we passed legislation to prevent non-citizens from voting in Washington, D.C.'s local elections. This bill, the SAVE Act, is one of many we hope to bring to the floor. In the past few decades, Americans' faith in the integrity of our elections has eroded, and it's Congress's responsibility to help restore confidence in our election system. The SAVE Act would do just that. Through the SAVE Act, we'll strengthen our elections administration and keep American elections for American citizens. In recent years, we've seen a growing number of jurisdictions across the country allow non-citizens to vote in municipal elections, including right here in our nation's capital. In Washington, D.C., a non-citizen only has to reside in the district for 30 days in order to vote. Imagine if that policy was applied across the country. The SAVE Act contains critical reforms to existing legislation and strengthens current law by requiring documentary proof of U.S. citizenship to register to vote in federal elections. The National Voter Registration Act currently requires states to give voter registration forms to everyone who receives a driver's license, regardless of citizenship. For example, in Illinois, like many states, non-citizens can obtain a driver's license. Under the NVRA, these non-citizens would be given voter registration forms. And just a few years ago, Illinois had to remove hundreds of non-citizens from its voter rolls. All an applicant has to do is check a box saying they're a citizen, and the citizenship verification process is over. Following the 2013 Supreme Court case, Arizona versus Intertribal, the NVRA prevents states from asking applicants for confirmation of citizenship. The SAVE Act would require states to obtain documentary proof of U.S. citizenship and identity in person when registering an individual to vote in a federal election. The change to the NVRA would direct states to establish a process for applicants who do not have documentary proof of citizenship, but are in fact U.S. citizens, under a process developed by the Election Assistance Commission. The SAVE Act would require states to set up a program to remove non-citizens from their voter rolls. In order to assist with this process, the bill would give states immediate and free access to federal and state databases with citizenship information. In a recent committee hearing, we heard evidence of non-citizens appearing on voter rolls in states across the country, and it's critical that we provide the resources states need to remove non-citizens from their voter rolls. By allowing this access, states can streamline registration processes and ensure that non-citizens are not registered to vote. Lastly, the SAVE Act will direct the Election Assistance Commission to update any guidance associated with the bill. The SAVE Act will also ensure that states with same-day registration can comply with the bill. American elections are for American citizens, and it's our duty to make sure it stays that way. Through our work on the Committee on House Administration, Republicans have worked tirelessly to protect American elections. President Biden issued an executive order directing federal agencies to use taxpayer money to register people to vote. By passing the SAVE Act, we can make sure that only eligible Americans are by passing the SAVE Act, we can make sure that only eligible American citizens are registered to vote. As we approach the 2024 election, election integrity is more important than ever. We must ensure Americans have confidence in our election system and that their vote will count according to the law. We must get the SAVE Act to the floor of the House of Representatives to vote to protect our elections. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Stile. Mr. Morelli, Ranking Member Morelli, you are recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Burgess.
And can I just say, it's good to have you back here in the Rules Committee. We spent a lot of hours up here together in years past. So welcome back.
Thank you.
We kept your place for you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member McGovern, and thank you to all the members of the committee. And I do want to express as well my sympathies to the Massey family for this tragedy, and our prayers are certainly with them. Thanks for allowing me time. It is great to be back here. I had the great privilege of serving for 4 years on the Rules Committee. I think I sat where Mr. Norman, my good friend from the 5th floor of Cannon, serves and sits, and enjoyed immensely the 4 years I was here. I wish today I was here under different circumstances. I am grateful for the work you do, and thank you for having me, but I must strongly object to the bill before us this afternoon. Every American should be absolutely clear about why Speaker Johnson and House Republicans are advancing this bill. For all the hysterical rhetoric surrounding the SAVE Act, Republicans have one real purpose here: to continue to erode the confidence of Americans in our election systems, to destroy, in fact, our faith in our democracy itself. And I cannot imagine a more disgraceful exercise. As members of Congress, we are obligated, we are duty-bound, we swore oaths to defend the Republic, not disfigure it. This bill is a vehicle for lies, plain and simple. The sole objective is to convince Americans, to scare them into believing that non-citizens, without a shred of evidence, are going to steal the election from Donald Trump. But Americans are not as naive as many of my colleagues think they are. Republicans know, they know that non-citizen registration and voting in federal elections is already illegal. To register is illegal. To vote is illegal. It leads to deportation. They know this simply does not happen. The Committee on House Administration has held several hearings on non-citizen voting, and my colleagues could not produce any evidence to back up their claims. In fact, Speaker Johnson admitted he had absolutely no proof of non-citizen voting in federal elections. But this is not a new project. As the ranking member has articulated, in 2020, Donald Trump and his allies, many of them in Congress, tried to deceive Americans about the security of our elections. They claimed that absentee ballots would lead to voter fraud. They claimed that extended early voting would lead to voter fraud. None of these claims ended up being true. Everyone in this room knows those claims were false, even if they will not admit as much. The Stop the Steal claims were lies, as history has shown, but led to one of the most shameful days in American history. The deadly, violent attack on this building on January 6, 2021 should never have happened. Should never, of course, be repeated. But as the ranking member has stated, the SAVE Act is a purposeful way to lay the groundwork to begin the conspiracy for another insurrection. The former president and his allies thought Americans were gullible enough to believe the lies of 2020. They hope Americans are gullible enough to believe those lies today. Americans, however, are smarter than you think. This bill will not solve any problems American elections do face, from chronic underfunding to constant violent threats against election administrators. What will the SAVE Act do? It will, quite simply, disenfranchise millions of eligible American citizens. It will greatly increase the burden, increase the cost in both time and money for any American citizen that wants their voice to be heard. The bill would especially burden military voters, tribal voters, rural voters, survivors of natural disasters, many of which we're experiencing throughout the country today, and the tens of millions of married women in America who have changed their names. The fact that by advancing the SAVE Act, Republicans will make it harder for men and women in uniform to register to vote shows how misguided this legislation is. Republicans are clearly telling the American people they believe that no barrier is too high to place in the way of the ballot, no burden too heavy for Americans to bear if they wish to vote. The SAVE Act is the most extreme, most radical election bill in living memory. It will quite literally disenfranchise millions of Americans. Republicans doing this all damage just to help Donald Trump undermine American faith in our democracy. As I said before, the American people are not as naive as Speaker Johnson and House Republicans think they are. They proved that in 2020, and they will prove it again this November. The tragedy here is that the Republican backers of this bill have such a poor view of their constituents, they're willing to lie to them in ways that they have already done irreparable damage to our nation, in ways that will continue to do untold damage to our nation's core identity, our elections, our democracy. I wish House Republicans had the courage to stand up and say enough is enough. I wish they had the courage to openly debate this damaging bill. Instead, the majority wants to move this legislation under a closed rule, blocking any amendments that could improve this fatally flawed SAVE Act. Sadly, I fear they don't. With that, Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank both of our witnesses for your testimony. Chairman Stiles, let me just ask you, in 2004, Congress passed the Secure ID Act. It was one of the 9/11 recommendations. In fact, congressional Democrats at the time were really anxious that the 9/11 recommendations be adopted into law. And the consequence of one of the 9/11 recommendations was that there be citizenship verification on state-issued IDs. So I know, the reason I'm asking you is because I thought in your testimony you said there was not a requirement, but in Texas, I was required to show a birth certificate or passport when I renewed a driver's license prior to a couple of years ago. And I thought that was because of the Secure ID Act that Congress had passed, and that all states now had come into conformity with the legislation passed by Congress in 2004, which again was a bipartisan piece of legislation. So is that now a requirement?
You do not need to be a U.S. citizen to get a real ID. Real ID can be used as a mechanism to show citizenship status if the state indicates that on the real ID, but you do not need to be a U.S. citizen to obtain a real ID.
So that does not.
In and of itself, it does not. It could be modified in a manner that would allow that, where you could identify a citizen on a real ID. A state could take that action. That would be a great step forward to enhance the integrity of our election.
Is that something that you've looked at your committee?
We've not delved into it in great detail, other than in the broader package of election proposals that we put forward. We have explored that as a mechanism that would be, I think, incredibly helpful in the U.S. election system.
Well, let me just ask you, can you address what Mr. Morelli said, that there's been no evidences? You've had the hearings in your committee. You looked at the evidence. Is there evidence that this, in fact, is necessary, the SAVE Act that we're bringing forward?
We've held a number of hearings, listened from a number of experts, and there is consistent evidence of non-citizens voting in U.S. elections, which is why this legislation is essential. We could look at a House race in 1996, a contested House race where, under further review, 624 non-citizens voted in a House race in California. And as we know, one of our colleagues is here who won by 6 votes in the state of Iowa. And so every single individual who's a non-citizen who votes illegally cancels out the vote of a U.S. citizen, and often we know House races are narrowly decided. And when we look back at the empirical evidence, and you see in 1996, over 600 non-citizens did vote. We can look at Fairfax County, Virginia, not far from where we sit here in our nation's capital. In 2011, we know over 117 individuals voted. We know that individuals are on the voter rolls in states like Ohio, where their Secretary of State recently removed those individuals. So we continually see this challenge prop up, which is exactly why this legislation is essential to pass.
Well, I thank you for your work on this. I thank you for your time and attention today. I'll yield to Mr. McGovern for any questions he might wish to ask.
Yeah, no, I have a few. Chairman Stiles, we received a letter from you requesting a closed rule, and then we received a letter from Ranking Member Morelli asking not even for an open rule, but for a structured rule. Why are you asking for a closed rule? I mean, do you really think that this bill can't be improved in any way, shape, or form, especially since some of us believe that this bill could disenfranchise millions and millions of people? What's the rationale behind shutting off all amendments for Democrats or Republicans?
We had an amendment process as we went through regular order at the committee level.
You're one committee. I mean, not just the people on your committee care about voting rights. People on the Rules Committee care about voting rights. The Judiciary Committee cares about voting rights. I would even say that people on the Transportation Committee care about voting rights. This is a big deal. And some of us believe that this bill will literally disenfranchise millions and millions of people. So I guess what is the justification for not allowing any amendments? Mr. Morelli has an amendment. He's the ranking member on your committee. Why should he be denied the right to offer and debate an amendment on the House floor?
Well, in fact, Mr. Morelli did offer amendments, and we debated those in committee, as I previously noted.
Yeah, so you had 12, how many members on your committee?
There's 12 in
There's
committee
12
on House
members on your
Administration.
committee. There's 435 members of the House. I mean, you don't think we should be able to debate these things, on something that impacts every single district in this country? I'm just stunned that my Republican friends who promised they wanted a more open process continue to insist on shutting down the process and closing things up so that no amendments can be offered. But I ask unanimous consent to put in the record the letters from both Chairman Stile and from Ranking Member Morelli on the request for a rule. I just find it stunning that on an issue, on a topic like this, that really not just 12 members have concerns about, that you are saying that we should shut the process down, which I'm sure that this committee will do, because that's what this committee normally does. Mr. Morelli, Chairman Stiles talked about the massive voter fraud. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, we have 350 million Americans. The odds that one or two non-citizen could ultimately vote, I suppose, is possible. But what's being posited to the American people, and what Speaker Johnson even talked about without having any evidence, suggestion is that there's massive efforts to get non-U.S. citizens to vote in federal elections. I'll repeat what I said earlier, which is it's illegal to register to vote in the United States if you're not a U.S. citizen. It's a further penalty if you actually voted in a federal election and weren't a U.S. citizen, which leads to deportation. So for all the suggestion that people are doing this in droves and risking both violations of law and deportation, crazy. There's no evidence that this is done, and certainly not any evidence done in a systematic way. So to make the extreme, and I mean extreme changes to election law, which federalizes it, by the way, my colleagues on the committee, particularly Republican colleagues, are always talking about how these are state elections, and the federal government should not involve itself in state elections. But here we are building a massive set of documentary requirements for people simply to register to vote. It is beyond, certainly given what is suggested is the problem. This is not even a solution in search of a problem. There's no problem, but this is a bad solution. And this would even go so far to potentially subject a poll worker to imprisonment and violating the law and imprisonment, even if they registered a voter who's a U.S. citizen. But if they didn't get all the documentary proof appropriately, they could face fines. I mean, we're already struggling to find people to work in elections, fearful of intimidation, fearful of threats against their life and their families. This will have a chilling effect. It simply is not a problem. And frankly, the couple of cases that were cited before the committee involved a government, state of Pennsylvania, state of Colorado, who made mistakes which they acknowledged, which they immediately went to enormous lengths to clarify, and there's no evidence that non-U.S. citizens are voting in federal elections.
Chairman Stile, are you familiar with Project 2025?
Only at a high level.
I mean, I'd urge you to read up on it a little bit more because it's horrifying. You should take a closer look at what some of your fellow Republicans have been up to. It's a plan to essentially install Trump as a dictator, which is what he said he wants. It's a roadmap to end American democracy, to ban abortion, to dismantle constitutional checks and balances, consolidate power into the Oval Office, and use the presidency for revenge against Trump's personal enemies. And when I say this would end our democracy, I'm not exaggerating. Project 2025 advocates for a terrifying expansion of federal power over the lives of everyday Americans, and it's deeply disturbing, and I encourage every American to look into it. Chairman Stile, do you know who Hans von Spakovsky is?
Yes, he's testified before my committee.
Yeah, because on May 16th, 2024, you and your Republican colleagues on the committee held a hearing on the SAVE Act, echoing election conspiracy theories and praising this bill. And one of the witnesses you called was Hans von Spakovsky, who is the author of Project 2025. When you invited him to testify on behalf of this bill, were you aware that he was one of the leading authors of Project 2025?
I'm familiar with his expertise in federal election law.
Yeah, so on May 23rd, 2024, a dark money think tank associated with the Heritage Foundation issued a public statement in support of the SAVE Act. And the Heritage Foundation is the organization behind the extremist proposals in Project 2025, and they are also publicly supporting the SAVE Act. Do you disavow their support, given what we know about Project 2025? I've explained to you what it does. Is that enough for you to distance yourself from their support of this bill?
Hans von Spakovsky is an absolute national expert in federal election law, was one of many witnesses who testified before us and walked us through, as many of our witnesses did, the challenges that we've seen of non-citizens voting in U.S. elections. It's the reason that this legislation is essential to make sure that we're protecting U.S. elections for U.S. citizens.
Yeah, and I get it. I mean, you've said over and over you think he's a credible. Obviously you believe the Heritage Foundation is a credible organization, and you believe he's a credible witness. But again, he is one of the major authors of the Project 2025. And you invited Mr. Spakovsky to testify in front of your committee, I think, on 3 separate occasions. Is that correct?
It could be up to 3, yeah. He is a national expert on federal election law.
For the record, my staff actually looked into it. He did testify 3 times. But when I look at this bill, and I look at some of the stuff in Project 2025, there's a lot of crossover here between this bill and Project 2025. And I think, it's one of the fears that we have is that, that this is, again, advancing this very radical idea, and that you would invite the author of Project 2025, one of the architects of this initiative, to basically be, one of your expert witnesses is a little bit disturbing. Let me ask you one final question. Do you think that the President has the authority to mobilize the National Guard to seize ballot boxes in Democratic states?
I'm not familiar with what you're discussing.
Well, I mean, let me say, in the last administration, prepared an executive order to do just that. Stephen Miller, who spoke at your press conference when you announced this bill, and who is reportedly also involved in Project 2025, has now apparently said, according to reporting, that he thinks a future Trump administration should nationalize the Guard for deployment in Democratic states. And as I said in my opening statement, this bill is all about sowing distrust and trying to undermine faith in our elections so that your side can continue to use non-existent voter fraud as an excuse to seize power if and when you lose. This is really serious and dangerous stuff. And I would urge you to actually read the Project 2025 proposal. It's something that hasn't been talked very much about. There's some reporting on it. I want to insert unanimous consent to insert 2 articles talking about the connection between Project 2025 and Donald Trump's candidacy. I hope I could.
Without objection.
I got to tell you, I find all this very, very chilling. And again, as I said in my opening statement, I think this is all about you guys fearful that you will lose the next election and trying to find an excuse to, like happened in the last election, to say that it wasn't a free and fair election, that it was a fraudulent election. Every single court in this country said it was a free and fair election. I mean, let me ask you one final question. Do you believe that Donald Trump lost the last election?
I'm pretty sure we're all aware President Biden's the President of the United States.
Well, that's not the answer to the question. The answer is whether you think Donald Trump lost. And the fact that it is so difficult for my Republican friends to even admit that he lost because you're afraid you'll offend him or some of his more extreme supporters, and that you bring people like one of the architects of Project 2025 to come and testify in favor of your bill, to have Stephen Miller at a press conference. Boy, this stuff is not good. I thank you for indulging me. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. And I just wanted to, they handed me a few facts about the amendment issue. And I do understand, Mr. Morelli, that there was one amendment submitted for this bill, and it was your amendment, and it was 219 pages long, and you submitted it less than 2 hours before the hearing, is my understanding.
Would the gentleman yield for?
Mr. McGovern?
Let's just set the record straight. There was no call for amendments. The Rules Committee usually puts out a call and asks people for amendments. They did not receive, no notice went out asking for amendments. And by the way, Mr. Morelli's amendment is actually germane. And he's a former Rules Committee member, too.
And Mr. McGovern, I had to make sure that I was clear on it. And there have been structured rules that have been done before without a call for amendments, and they are still allowed to submit amendments. Members are still allowed to
So can we do it now? He has an amendment. If we can make this germane amendment in order, great. This shouldn't be controversial.
And Mr. McGovern, they're saying there was no opportunity to vet. I think that was part of the point, where it is a 219-page amendment submitted less than 2 hours before, and there was no opportunity to vet and look through the amendment and understand what was in it.
We were just told it was offered in committee, so this is not a new concept. So, I don't. I appreciate the gentlelady's indulgence. I think we just got to call it out for what's happening here. This is about basically making sure that no amendments can be offered, that there could be no debate. This is about shutting down the process.
Mr. McGovern,
Yes.
I'm going to recall my time because, reclaim my time because, no, that's not what it is about. It is about the opportunity for staff to be able to understand an amendment that is 218 pages long. And I understand you're going to say it was
And the committee of
admitted, it was
jurisdiction
put in.
would be the one that would vet it, and they had a chance to look at it.
I'm
So,
reclaiming my time.
You don't have to vote for it. I'm just saying, can we make it in order?
Mr. Chair, or Mr. McGovern, it is just 2 hours beforehand that this was submitted. And I understand you're going to say that it was submitted in committee, but then it should have been submitted earlier than that, or anything to make sure that this, so we're not, we are not shutting things down. This is one amendment.
We're shutting
It
this
was
process
one
down.
amendment.
This- Yeah, on a voting rights bill. We don't know
I
what
reclaim my
amendments we
time,
would have
Mr.
gotten if we
McGovern.
had-
I reclaim my
if
time.
we put out a call for amendments.
Mr. McGovern. Well, and just my understanding is that, like I said, there was the one amendment, but I do have a couple of questions for for the chairman, Mr. Stile. Mr. Morelli had mentioned, I think it was that we were, there was claims about not having a military, I think it was military, a woman who needs to change her name, or anyone who changes their names in natural disasters, that we are somehow impeding them from voting. And I was wondering if maybe you could dispel some of those claims.
So anyone, regardless of sex, gender, color, creed, can obtain a driver's license. Anyone, regardless of sex, can obtain a birth certificate. Anyone, regardless of sex, could obtain a Social Security card or other documentary proof of citizenship. So if an individual goes through to change their name, they would get an updated state-issued ID. They may update their Social Security card. So the process in this instance, as it relates to documentary proof for voting, would mirror those changes.
So that in no way impedes their, like the claims were made, that would impede their ability to vote?
It would not, in the context that it's the same process that we would go through for other actions when an individual would change their name.
Thank you very much. And in my state, Minnesota is one of the states that allows illegal immigrants to obtain driver's licenses and other state IDs. And can you talk about more about why states like Minnesota are increasingly difficult to root out non-citizen voting when they're allowing non-citizens to get those IDs that are necessary for voting?
Well, obviously, I'm not only so nuanced on the state of Minnesota's election laws, but states obviously that have photo ID. Photo ID in particular, an individual that has a driver's license where the state gives driver's licenses to illegal immigrants would not be able to utilize that as a mechanism to determine citizenship. And again, under HAVA, the congressionally passed law, states aren't allowed to require proof of citizenship. And that comes from a Supreme Court case, Arizona versus Intertribal, that says the HAVA law preempts state law and prevents states from checking proof of citizenship. It's why this legislation is so essential to not only allow states to confirm citizenship of a voter, but to require states to obtain proof of citizenship from a voter. And so as the United States has countless individuals who are here both legally and illegally as non-citizens, has grown dramatically. This is an opportunity for us to make sure that we're protecting the integrity of U.S. elections for U.S. citizens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And
I'm sorry, may I
Mr.
just
Morelli?
respond on the military? So if you're in the United States military and you try to register, your military ID will no longer be sufficient. You'll have to bring your military record with you, which shows your place of birth. But if your place of birth was outside the United States, you could still be a U.S. citizen. You could have either been born abroad to U.S. citizens, or if you were born in Germany and came to the United States as a child and became a U.S. citizen and served in the military, now you'd have to show your military ID, your military service record, which doesn't show you having been born in the United States. Now you got to get additional information that demonstrates you're a U.S. citizen. This is for someone who's serving in the military, who's a U.S. citizen, to have to go through 3 or 4 documentary pieces of evidence just to register to vote in the United States. Is that what we want in this country? Is that the kind of barriers we're going to put in front of people? And frankly, you'd have to go to a council, get a counselor report of birth abroad if that was the case. It's just expensive. It's those kind of barriers. Right now, you go with your driver's license or your military ID. It ought to be sufficient to register to vote, particularly when you're asserting that you are indeed a U.S. citizen. That's required.
Chairman Stile, you want to respond?
Well, I think it's important to note that while that would be one mechanism of showing your documentary proof of citizenship, showing a U.S. military ID together with U.S. military service record, showing the applicant's place of birth, that would be one option an individual could utilize to demonstrate documentary proof of citizenship. Obviously, a valid U.S. passport, a real ID with citizenship indicated on it. But also in this legislation, we set forward a path for the Elections Assistance Commission to set up a structure to allow additional mechanisms to provide proof of citizenship. And so what I mean by that is making sure that we're providing access to U.S. databases that can confirm citizenship of an individual, providing that at no cost and in near real-time opportunity.
Thank you. And I just want to say thank you for bringing the bill forward, and Mr. Roy, thank you very much, because I hear it more often than not that constituents are asking for election integrity, and I appreciate that you brought this forward. And I know that there's a lot of conspiracy theories that are being discussed from from the other side, but I think that we need to be looking at election integrity, and I appreciate you bringing it forward. And with that, I would call on, I believe, Mrs. Scanlon from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Okay, so we have a bill here which is pretending to protect our election systems from people who are not citizens voting in our federal elections. But let's be clear that that's not happening. It's already illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal elections, and there is no evidence that non-citizens are voting in federal elections. No study backs this up. Including, in fact, to the contrary, the Cato Institute has put out a study that found that non-citizens don't vote illegally in detectable numbers. Sure, things happen everywhere, but this is not a real issue. Voter fraud is incredibly rare, and non-citizen voting is even more rare. So all this bill is going to do is disenfranchise American citizens. This bill repeats the GOP playbook for modern-day voter suppression, which we've already seen and rejected in my home state or Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and numerous other states. So by that I mean when you implement strict voter ID requirements which discriminate against eligible voters by limiting the forms of ID which the law will recognize for voting purposes. The classic example is the state that allows voters to vote if they have a hunting ID but not a student ID. So we don't need to look too far for examples of restrictive ID. One of the primary forms of ID allowed by this bill is real ID, which, as Chairman Stile noted, it does not, in fact, say that it shows citizenship, and in fact, non-citizens can get real ID in a number of different situations, and not all states indicate citizenship. So we're imposing yet another burden upon our states if they're going to have to go back and add citizenship to their real ID issuance. But beyond that, again, something we're very familiar with in Pennsylvania is that people have not gotten real ID. It's estimated that only 20% of eligible Pennsylvanians will have real ID by the time it becomes mandatory in a year. Other states are similar. Kentucky, I think, is only around 30%, because many states had large conservative factions who were afraid of real ID, who did not want it to be mandatory because they did not want there to be a national ID system. They did not want big government issuing national ID. So there's been very slow uptick, and it's kind of, I think as Mr. Morelli noted, it's a little bit odd that we have the House Republicans pushing additional requirements here upon our states and upon people who are resistant to Big Brother knowing everything about them. We saw the privacy concerns, the low acceptance rate of Real ID, and it's been around since 2005, and we still have less than half the people who could get it using it, shows that if you put an administrative burden on citizens to prove their citizenship, in order to register to vote, if you don't make it easy for them to do that, you're going to reduce the number of registered voters, which is something that we had to address when we had strict voter ID rules in Pennsylvania, and we proved that 600,000 eligible voters in Pennsylvania were going to be disenfranchised because the forms of ID, which had been accepted by the Republican legislature under that legislation, were too restrictive, and we see a similar thing happening here. If this bill passes and it's implemented nationwide, Republicans will have taken away the vote from millions of eligible American voters. Not to mention that it's going to place a significant financial and administrative burden on our state governments, which are already struggling to keep up with the requirements for Real ID and other forms here. Do our Republican colleagues know this? Did they not do their homework when drafting this bill, or was the purpose of the bill not really to address this non-existent problem, but just to give an opportunity to talk about voter fraud that doesn't exist? So it's pushing lies about our elections. It's really problematic, and I just obviously can't support this bill because it goes contrary to all of the evidence and a lot of work that I've seen and participated in over the years. Ranking Member Morelli, Mr. Stile mentioned that Real ID in and of itself doesn't indicate citizenship, and that not all states have such a marker. Has there been any testimony or any evidence before the committee, which brings this bill to us, about how many states do indicate citizenship?
No, there's no requirement that Real ID have citizenship on it. So even though it's cited as documentary evidence, it's only for those states who would require citizenship on Real ID. But Real ID does not, as the chairman indicated, does not have that requirement. I mean, here's the challenge, is it's going to take an armful of documentary evidence and a lot of work now to register to vote. The barriers for married women who have a different name than is on their birth certificate. And even if they showed a birth certificate, their driver's license, they're going to have two different names. One is the name that they were given at birth. One is if they've changed their name, those aren't going to agree. You're going to have to provide documentary. I mean, think about this, the steps that you'll need to take simply to register, which is your right as a U.S. citizen to vote in elections. But now you're going to have to go through more information than you'd have to do almost any other activity, and this is guaranteed by law. It really is shocking the amount of evidence will be necessary. And by the way, if you went to register to vote and you had a birth certificate and your married name, or I'm sorry, a driver's license, your married name, and a birth certificate with a different name, and the poll worker knew you because they're in the same neighborhood, and so I'm going to let this person register to vote, they did that, they'd be guilty of a federal crime. They could face jail time. And by the way, it doesn't mean that you weren't a U.S. citizen. It just means they didn't compile the proper documentary evidence because they knew who you were. I mean, is that what we want now for poll workers who know you, who know you're a citizen, who live down the street from you to be facing jail time because they didn't get the documentary evidence that they thought was, that the bill requires as evidence that you're a U.S. citizen? Boy, that's shocking to me.
Well, it's shocking and it's chilling of probably one of our most fundamental American rights, to have a say in who runs the country, who we get to vote for. So thank you for your testimony. I would yield back.
Thank you very much. I would yield to Mr. Norman of South Carolina.
Thank you. Joe, good to see you here.
Nice to see you, Mr.
Thank you all
Norman.
for coming. I keep saying there's no proof that, illegals are being not only registered, but they're doing it illegally because they're illegal. Is it not true that Pennsylvania admitted a few years ago 10,000 non-citizens were registered to vote? Is it not true that Texas had a similar problem where nearly 100,000 non-citizens were allowed to vote? Is it not true that Illinois implemented automatic voter registration several years ago and hundreds of non-citizens ended up on the rolls? Is it not true that Ohio had upwards of 100, I think, in one precinct of non-citizens? Is it not true that a Georgia audit found more than 1,600 non-citizens had attempted to register to vote? Virginia had nearly 1,500. When you look at what's happening in this country with the illegals, Congressman Stiles, why is this president allowing what we know of is 13 million plus in this country without any barriers? Why do you think, what goals does this administration have?
I have a lot of questions on a lot of actions.
Could it be registering to vote and including them in the census?
Could be.
What consequence, at the voter, when you register to vote today at the bottom, you fill the questionnaire out. At the bottom, I am a U.S. citizen. You check that. What consequences are there if you fraudulently check the box and then you're not?
That is a federal penalty. But what we're noting is the states cannot require additional proof of citizenship. So if we look at HAVA, the federally passed Help America Vote Act, and then we analyze the 2013 decision, Arizona versus Intertribal, which says that federal preemption prevents states from actually requiring or looking further after that box has been checked. The concern is states don't have an ability today to confirm citizenship beyond the self-attestation that you just noted. And so this bill provides an ability for states to do that. Not only that, it requires it to make sure that U.S. elections are for U.S. citizens.
So this is just more of a verification that if you check that box, there's a way to have consequences for those who are doing it fraudulently.
Not only that, but it's actually a check that that box has been, that there's confirmation that you are a U.S. citizen rather than simply allowing an individual to check a box.
Well, what in South Carolina, we had noticed that there were 3 plane loads of illegals that came into Spartanburg County that were going in the Medicaid, the government offices, and they're giving them a registration. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but to verify that they are who they say they are, what we're doing is involving the Secretary of State, and we're doing this as we speak. There are 2 statutes that have never been used that we're citing in this. And we're going to the Homeland Security to get, and we've used the last year of new registrants. And we're going to check and see, and it's been, like this administration has in so many cases, they just don't respond. When they don't respond here, then we're going to sue them to get the information and then keep ratcheting that down. Does this, is this a stepping stone toward the verification of when you check that box, you are a registered citizen of this country?
I'd go beyond a stepping stone. I'd say that this actually provides the proof that an individual who's registering to vote is a U.S. citizen by providing one of the documentary proof mechanisms that is in this bill.
And to have secure elections, we need to verify that. I may verify that I go the speed limit, but I've got consequences if I do not. There's no consequences on this, especially with 15 million illegals in this country to begin with. Mr. Morelli, do you have anything on that?
Yeah, first I'd say, as it relates to South Carolina, aside from the federal prohibition, South Carolina law already requires individuals to be a U.S. citizen to vote not only in federal but state and local elections. And the state has numerous systems, as I understand, in place to prevent non-citizens from registering and casting a ballot. And when registering to vote, every single voter must swear under oath in South Carolina that U.S. citizens are eligible to vote and that they are a U.S. citizen. Giving false information, as I understand it, can result in substantial prison time, not for federal charges, but because it violates South Carolina statute. In addition to facing prison time potentially, South Carolina State Election Commission also conducts active audits of voter lists to ensure that non-citizens are not on the rolls. So, and as I understand it as well, the South Carolina State Elections Commission has found no evidence, and they've indicated this publicly, that non-citizens are registered to vote in the state. So I think South Carolina not only has made it their business in federal, which is already against federal law, but also at the state law to do it. And as I understand it, and I defer to you as to whether or not you have faith in the South Carolina State Election Commission, but they have published reports after doing continuous audits that there is no such, that is an activity that doesn't happen.
But we had them on the line last week. And by checking the box, that there's been no further gathering of information to make sure that that box is true, that what they say. That came from them last week. And that's why it's so interesting. They're all in favor of what we're doing in South Carolina. Ms. Stiles, you have something?
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Congressman Norman, is that once that box is checked by an individual, federal law with the Supreme Court interpretation actually prevents further proof of citizenship or a requirement that the box that's checked is actually validated that that individual actually is a U.S. citizen. I think I was previously said HAVA, I should have said NVRA.
NVRA,
And so
right.
when NVRA is reviewed by the Supreme Court in 2013 in Arizona versus Intertribal, what they're saying is with federal preemption that states are not able to actually go through and verify the citizenship of an individual that checks the box. And so once that box is checked, the whole step is complete. This legislation is authored by Congressman Roy, says, no, what we're going to do is actually require proof of citizenship, provide that documentary proof that the individual that checks the box is actually a U.S. citizen to further enhance the integrity of our elections.
So it's just verifying that once you check that box, you are who you say you are.
Exactly.
And in South Carolina, there hadn't been any steps taken. They were unaware of this. Now, we're going through the Homeland Security to get the information. And Stephen Miller has done a lot of work on this. And this is the 2 laws that he has we're making, is what we'll be using to. But, this Biden administration, if they really want to have honest and fair elections, let's verify it. Again, if I get caught speeding, I think I have a ticket. There's a way to verify that. It's called a meter, speed meter. But with voting and with this invasion that this president is allowing, it's criminal to not do this. And I hope other states will do the same thing. Look, thank you, Chip. Thank you for bringing this up, and look forward to supporting it. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Norman, and I would call on Mr. Roy from Texas.
I thank the chair. Appreciate the gentleman from appearing. Just a couple of questions. For the chairman, I think you just articulated some of the things I wanted to make sure was clear for the record about what we're talking about here. Under current law, but I want to make sure it's clear for everyone to understand. Under current law, if a state wants to ensure that it is only a citizen voting, does that state face barriers to ensuring that that is the case?
100%, that's an accurate statement. They're not allowed, they're actually prevented from asking applicants for documentary proof of U.S. citizenship under current law, and that's the Supreme Court's decision in 2013 of Arizona versus Intertribal, their review of NVRA and federal preemption.
And as such, has that caused problems, for example, with respect to Arizona, where Arizona currently basically operates 2 separate systems, where they register individuals checking proof of citizenship for state and local elections, but they, on the federal side, do not, because of this barrier put in place prohibiting them, in essence, due to the court's interpretation of MVRA, prohibiting them from being able to check citizenship. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes.
And what we're endeavoring to do here, which obviously was debated and amended in committee, if I'm correct, I believe that the ranking member's amendment was offered in committee and failed 6-1.
That's accurate.
And there was a significant number of Democrats not present at that hearing.
6-1 indicates that.
Right. And so that amendment was offered. There was, at least debate with the one Democrat who was present, given that there were no other Democrats present at the hearing. But with respect to what we're trying to do with this legislation, we're trying to first make sure that barrier is brought down, but go a step further, given the extent to which we now have, and I would ask the chairman if he agrees with me, increasing evidence that there are jurisdictions seeking to register non-citizens to vote, at least at allegedly the state and local level, but wink, wink, nod, nod, don't worry, we'll never have those registrants being involved in federal voting. But the truth is, there's an expansive view in Oakland, San Francisco, New York, tried to happen here in the District of Columbia, right? We had a vote on that here in the House. So would the gentleman agree what we're seeking to do is to do what many states do right now and attempt to do, but are prevented because of the Supreme Court opinion, require a documentary proof of citizenship to be able to vote in federal elections to be able to address this problem?
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly what we're trying to do with this legislation, is allow states to have that opportunity to provide documentary proof of citizenship. In fact, require it. And I think you correctly note this administration is working aggressively to roll out a secretive plan on voter registration. In fact, they put forward an executive order 14019 requiring every agency to put forward a strategic plan as to how they were going to help get out the vote in effect. And they won't provide us with that strategic plan. I've subpoenaed the 15 administration officials to get that, because I think taxpayers deserve to know how their taxpayer dollars are being used. So you have this administration working in secret to try to roll out and utilize the federal government to get a get out the vote operation. We're, in contrast, just trying to make sure that U.S. citizens are the ones who are voting in U.S. elections.
Gentlemen, aware with respect to the problem we're identifying that our colleagues have suggested does not exist, that there is a significant amount of evidence of people who are non-citizens voting in our elections. A study, for example, professors at Old Dominion University and George Mason University from 2014, finding that non-citizens participate in U.S. elections, and that this participation has been large enough to change meaningful election outcomes, including electoral college votes. You aware of that study?
Yes, and we've looked at a number of examples in our committee hearing. I actually think one of the most pertinent examples is the congressional review of the 46th congressional district race in California in 1996, where they actually did a retrospective analysis on who voted. And it was documented that 624 non-citizens voted in that election. And if we extrapolate that across 435 House districts, or you just look at it at a House district where we know often House races are determined by less than 600 votes. We have a colleague from Iowa where it was 6 votes. And so there is documentary proof of non-citizens voting in U.S. elections, and this is why your legislation is so essential.
And it's true that there are multiple states in which in the electoral college process are states that have been determined by thousands of votes, right? I mean, 10,000 votes in Georgia, less than that in certain other states, 15,000, you know, so those votes are meaningful.
In my home state of Wisconsin, a landslide is 20 or 30,000 total votes. I mean,
Right.
a few thousand votes here or there can swing any battleground state.
The study that I quoted from Old Dominion George Mason estimated that 6.4% of non-citizens voted in the 2008 election, which would represent 1.2 million non-citizen votes cast. I do want to, with all respect, correct my friend from South Carolina. There was a report out of Texas of a number that he quoted about 95,000. He said almost 100,000. That number was later corrected to be 25,000. There was a mistake in the counting. But for the record, there were 25,000 in Texas in that report. Virginia last year removed 1,481 voter registrants for non-citizen status. North Carolina conducted a study in 2014 with over 1,400 registered voters. In 2024, an audit carried out in Ohio flagged 137 individuals. There's list after list after list. And I would note that there are examples, I assume my colleague is aware of, certain of our Democrat colleagues, one in particular in January 2024, saying, quote, "I need more people in my district just for redistricting purposes," in a direct response to the border crisis. Does the gentleman remember that
Very much so.
statement? In other words, the idea that there's not a problem is belied by the facts. The idea that there's not a problem with respect to our border is, of course, belied by the facts. And I'm always entertained by this notion that, well, it's illegal already. Why do you guys need to do this? Well, number one, well, then what are you worried about? Number two, if it being illegal solves the problem, then the fact that it is illegal for people to enter the United States, you would think would solve this rather enormous problem of millions of people being released into the United States, correct?
That's spot on.
Yet here we sit. I would note, in addition, that we've got some people raising issues about that this will cause a burden to those who wish to vote for citizens. Is the gentleman aware is that the list of items that we put in the legislation mirrors numerous existing state laws? For example, that bastion of wing nuttery, the state of Massachusetts. The language that we put in the bill is very similar to that which is put forward by the state of Massachusetts. Does the gentleman agree?
Yep.
And the documentation that we talked about, we have provisions replete in the bill to allow people and allow administrators to create mechanisms, for example, for women, spouses who change names, individuals who want to be able to provide a different route to be able to provide evidence if they run into a barrier with, coming up with a passport or a real ID, or in the military examples. Is that correct?
The EAC opportunity to provide that guidance to states is a key component of the bill.
And a last, I think, important point, which is the extent to which this is very inherently a role for Congress and a federal issue. The extent to which the Constitution very much contemplates that, of course, the time, place, and manner of holding elections, shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations, right? Then you follow the jurisprudence and you figure out, okay, there's some debate about whether the how versus the who, that question which the court has raised. In this case, of course, the Constitution contemplates that the naturalization clause puts Congress, frankly, the court has placed it maybe even higher than intended, Congress at the full center of making determinations about all things naturalization. So the combination of the Elections Clause and the Naturalization Clause, combined with the numerous amendments, the 15th, 19th, 24th, 26th, all referencing, quote, the right of citizens of the United States to vote, I think clearly demonstrates the power and the duty of Congress to act in this case. Would the gentleman from Wisconsin agree?
I agree.
And so at the end of the day, we have the power, we have the duty, we have legislation to resolve a very real and growing problem. We have 80+% of Americans wanting us to solve said problem and guarantee that only citizens vote. We have put forward legislation to do that under the powers that we have under the Constitution. We are solving a real barrier to states being able to conduct their duty to do this and providing a mechanism for federal elections only, a requirement that it be consistent across the country. Is that a fair characterization?
It's fair.
I yield back.
Thanks, gentleman. Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good to see you. I very much enjoyed my time on House Administration and on the Subcommittee on Elections. Boy, what a difference there is when you change from Democrats to Republicans, right? You were not there, Ranking Member, but the chair and I sat through many a hearing when we talked about how wonderful it was that we had actually had an increase in voter participation in 2020. And my thought was, why don't we get very excited about that and make it easier and make sure that more Americans vote, right? Because that is democracy. We just celebrated the 4th of July. We should make it easier for American citizens to vote. And instead, we have this bill, which would make it harder for American citizens to vote. So you wonder why. Is it because the 2020 general election featured both the most Americans voting, but the Republican candidate lost? You know, because this bill goes after the communities that helped President Biden win. For example, polling of military personnel in 2020 showed that they didn't trust Trump as commander-in-chief, and many were shifting from voting Republican to voting for Biden. Mr. Chair, I'd like to enter into the record the 2020 NBC article. Trump says the military will vote for him, but he lost their support long ago. Trump treats the armed forces as just another entity he can manipulate for political purposes. That's alienated the troops and the top brass alike, close quote.
Without objection.
So this bill would make it harder for military personnel to sign up and vote. Our men and women in uniform, you know, they give up so much. They travel, they're away from home, it's not easy to vote. And you touched upon this earlier, Ranking Member, but what's your reaction when you see Republicans making it harder for military to vote? And do you see any good reason in treating our military that way?
I can, I think I articulated the barriers that would exist, and it's certainly not only for the military, although it does raise a number of questions, but just the kind of burdens that would now be placed on people simply to register to vote when there is scant evidence that there is any concern, despite what people say, there's not a concerted effort that I'm aware of to have non-U.S. citizens register, because frankly, you'd be putting them in harm's way. Just the registration is illegal, and certainly voting is subject to criminal penalties as well as deportation. It simply doesn't happen. In fact, the George Mason study, which was referenced, has been completely debunked by experts in the field of statistical survey data, and it's been debunked by so many different experts. And in the decade since the report was published, its authors have not published a defense of their research work, and nothing has made it through a peer review that survives any serious scrutiny. So there is, despite, you know, anybody could put out a paper, I guess, but when it's debunked by experts who looked at the survey data, I think it begs the question. And when you don't, and when you don't rebut that criticism, I think that says a great deal. But this, to your point, and I think this is a really important point, which is the problem in America is not too many people voting, it's that participation still lags behind. I mean, when when half of the eligible people in an American election vote, register and vote, I think that says a great deal. We should be making this easier for people to access the ballot, not more difficult. And frankly, the amount of documentary evidence that this bill anticipates is extraordinary. I doubt that every Republican in the House has read through the amount of barriers and hurdles you would now have to register to vote.
Right, and when we're talking about military participate at a lower level anyway, right? They put their lives on the line, but because it's so difficult, they participate at about 27% points lower than the regular American voter. And you're going to make it harder for them? Really? So Native Americans, right? Native Americans are also targeted, in essence, by this bill. And we know that Native Americans in Arizona helped President Biden win that state. The Arizona law that was attempting to depress that vote, one of the court cases I remember said it was like us taking a scalpel to the communities that helped fuel President Biden's win in Arizona, Native Americans and Latinos. You were in Arizona. You were in New Mexico, weren't you? So tell us some of the stories that you heard.
Well, look, I did, thank you for that. I released just today a report on voting for Native peoples, barriers and policy solutions. Not only did I spend time in Arizona and New Mexico meeting with tribal leaders and tribal members, but staff has spent a great deal of time traveling around the country. There are significant barriers to tribal residents voting, which are detailed in the report. I would encourage people to read it. I mean, these are the first Americans, and they have been treated despite the Citizenship Act, which is, we celebrated its 100th passage and enactment, still enormous barriers. This will only make it more difficult, as you know, and tribal IDs will no longer be accepted because they don't meet the standard in the new bill in terms of registration.
Right, so Native Americans, the first Americans, right, who are clearly citizens, who didn't get the citizenship until about 100 years ago, and we're still making it hard? We are still making it hard? Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record the report.
Without objection.
So, you know, it is just outrageous that we would do that. And then it hurts me a lot. I represent a rural district. And rural districts, like voting absentee and voting by mail is important in rural areas. You know, in November, the snow comes and a lot of people like to register and participate by mail and absentee. And it makes sense, right? And this will make that harder. Is that correct, Ranking Member?
Well, excuse me, it absolutely would. In many states, mail-in voting has been the standard for decades and decades without any alarm bells ringing that there's been any fraud involved. Arizona, 85% of voters vote by mail. States like Oregon and Colorado have long traditions of mail-in voting. If you're a rural resident in the United States, very often long distances between you and polling places. So mail, telephone, the internet, wherever possible, are the ways that you conduct your daily life. These will make most of these activities impossible as it relates to voting. So it just makes it, again, more difficult. It would prevent rural Americans from registering to vote by mail or online, requires an applicant to present documentary proof of citizenship in person at the office of an appropriate election official. That's in the bill. It would force millions of rural Americans who have registered to vote online or via mail to travel significant distance to present documents to government officials, something they currently have to do, they don't have to do, and have not had to do for decades now. And I do want to mention, 48% of Americans don't have passports, one of the forms of citizenship that the bill suggests. This is an insurmountable barrier to many people who would try to register for the first time, and it would burden rural voters who often have limited access to the types of government offices that you would find in urban settings that would help them access the documentary proof of citizenship, like passport services. So even if you wanted to get a passport, it's difficult to get to the offices. So it is voter suppression that targets rural Americans, hurts military personnel, hurts women who have changed their name as a result of marriage. I mean, students, you name it, the list is long of people who would be burdened by these new requirements.
And when we look at what was the coalition that led to the victory for Biden, these are the kinds of people, and this is the kind of voting that led to that, and they are under attack. You know, this week of, July 4th and celebrating freedom and democracy, democracy does not exist without strong voter participation, and it's shameful and unpatriotic when Republicans take aim at voter participation. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Ranking Member?
Well, just that, again, our goal ought to be to make sure every single American, every citizen in this country has access to the ballot. Sadly, too few do, too few participate, and putting more burdens on them is unacceptable if our goal is to make sure every single American is heard at the ballot box and that their votes count. That's what we ought to be focused on. I think that's what the Congress ought to be doing. That's what the Freedom to Vote Act does. That's why we offered it as amendment. Sadly, it wasn't deemed in order under the closed rule, but we'll keep fighting for it.
Right. And the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act used to be bipartisan. It passed 98-0 last time. And now Republicans have abandoned the Voting Rights Act. And that is once again in this month of celebrating our anniversary as a country that is founded on democracy. It is both shameful and unpatriotic. And I oppose this rule and bill. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair thanks the gentlelady. Recognizes the gentlelady from Indiana for questions. And I hope you will give Chairman Stile a chance to respond to some of this.
Sure. Actually, I would love for Chairman Stile to respond, and then I'd be happy to go into some of my questions.
Well, I think what's so important is that we're making sure that people are participating in our elections. And what we have seen time and again is the integrity in our elections increase. People are more likely to participate. It's actually the reason when we introduced a series of election integrity bills that we did that in Atlanta, Georgia. Because I think a lot of people remember the lies that were spewed about the election integrity legislation in the state of Georgia. In fact, President Biden made statements that even the Washington Post called out is earning Pinocchios for being so misleading to the American people about what the state of Georgia was doing when they were implementing their voter integrity legislation. You may recall Major League Baseball bought into those lies. They moved out the All-Star game out of Atlanta. But what we can do now is go back and look at the empirical data of the 2022 election. And what we saw is high voter participation, and the University of Georgia did a robust study analyzing the elections after they took place. And what the University of Georgia found is that people actually were very supportive of how the elections were run, and across all key demographic groups, in particular blacks in the state of Georgia, had a very positive view of how those elections operated, in direct contrast with the misleading statements and, in fact, lies by some on the left of what the bill would actually do. And so what we see time and again, and the empirical evidence shows this, is that when we actually increase the integrity of our elections, more people are likely to participate, and that's a good thing. And so when we look at this legislation, this is an opportunity to further enhance the integrity of our elections and actually increase total voter participation of U.S. citizens.
Thank you. On Joe Biden's first day in office, he issued a myriad of executive orders. Some of those I will highlight here. One, repealed a previous executive order by President Trump, which had secured the southern border, took all that away. All of those policies that were keeping the border secure were undone by Joe Biden on day one. Another executive order on day one stopped funds from being directed toward border wall construction. And then another executive order allows for non-citizens to be counted in the census data for electoral college and congressional apportionment. Now, under President Biden, we've seen millions of illegal aliens being released into the interior of the United States, 2 million known gotaways. The Biden administration's failure at the southern border has been well documented. It is a complete and total disaster. In addition to the executive order President Biden signed on day one, he also made an executive order that said, it was the executive order on promoting access to voting that requires federal agencies to expand opportunities to register to vote. So all of these things are pointing in a direction, at least pointing in a direction that I believe is wrong for the United States of America, and it undermines our system of democracy, which is why I support the SAVE Act. The failure to secure the southern border is one thing, but in what we've heard today in this committee and from our colleagues on the other side of the aisle is that they unbelievably think that we're somehow diminishing the vote or the opportunity to vote of American citizens by requiring proof of citizenship for someone to vote. How does that, Mr. Stile, Chairman Stile, does it diminish the opportunities for U.S. citizens to express their viewpoints at the ballot box by allowing non-citizens to vote?
Every non-citizen that vote cancels out the vote of a U.S. citizen. And so when we look at the instances of non-citizens voting, and again, there's ample evidence of non-citizens voting in U.S. elections, each person who has voted illegally as a non-citizen is canceling out the vote of a legal U.S. citizen. And that's why there should be such concern. And then you correctly note what this administration is doing. I think that's really important, Ms. Houchin, is you correctly lay out that on day one, the Biden administration comes in and unwinds the secure border policies of President Trump, and we see a massive rush of individuals enter the country illegally and then enter throughout the country. You combine that then with the president's executive order, which you also noted, 14019, which is weaponizing federal agencies in the engagement of a partisan get-out-the-vote effort. And in fact, inside that executive order, the administration required each federal agency to come up with a strategic plan. But they won't give that strategic plan to me or to the American people, and that should be incredibly concerning, that this administration has weaponized federal agencies to develop a secretive scheme to use federal agencies to drive forward a partisan agenda as it relates to elections. And you couple that with the open border policies of this administration, it should give great concern to Americans across the board. And when we look at an opportunity here to simply say, what we want to do is make sure that U.S. elections are for U.S. citizens, to make sure that we're not allowing the NVRA to be used as a block from checking whether or not an individual is a U.S. citizen, this legislation gives us an opportunity to make sure it's U.S. citizens who are participating in U.S. elections.
Thank you. And it's interesting that not only do our colleagues on the other side of the aisle not want to require U.S. citizenship as a matter of who should be voting in this country, but they also do not support voter ID laws to make sure that it is one person, one vote. Chairman Stile, the ranking member has made some claims that requiring proof of citizenship creates a hardship for citizens. I'd like you to just, and you've done this somewhat, but I'd like you to just provide a counter to that. In your view, articulate why the ranking member is wrong in his claim that there's some sort of a hardship for citizens simply by requiring them to prove that they're U.S. citizens to vote.
So we offer a series of opportunities for an individual to provide documentary proof of citizenship. So obviously the passport, it was referenced by my colleague, that is one opportunity. We could look at Real ID for those Real IDs that have U.S. citizenship denoted on it. More states should take advantage of that inside Real ID so that it can be utilized. But again, today, under current law, states aren't allowed to even validate the individual who checks the box to say they're a U.S. citizen is a U.S. citizen. So many states didn't put that in the requirements. It's a huge opportunity when we clean this up after this bill passes to make sure that Real ID has that opportunity where states can then quickly validate that. That's going to be a huge opportunity. And then we look at the EAC to put forward guidance to states to address some of the concerns that have been brought up, to make sure that an individual who has a name change, et cetera, has that opportunity to not be burdened as they go to vote. But again, under current law, states aren't even allowed to review whether or not an individual is a U.S. citizen. This bill not only gives the opportunity, but requires it, which I think is essential to make sure that it's U.S. citizens that are participating in U.S. elections.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your leadership on this issue of election integrity. It's extremely important, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair thanks the gentlelady. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Langworthy, for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd also like to thank my colleague on the Rules Committee, Representative Roy, for leading this legislation, the SAVE Act. As a member of Congress from one of the states that has recently attempted to allow non-citizens to vote in our local elections and has simultaneously pursued sanctuary policies that have led to a flood of illegal immigration, I am very proud to be a co-sponsor of this bill that seeks to protect a key institution of our democratic system amid an unprecedented crisis on our southern and our northern borders. Our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, however, don't seem to care about the real and the documented threat facing the security of our elections here. They will say, and they have said, that the number of illegal aliens who have attempted to vote in our federal elections is small compared to vote totals. But Chairman Stile, in your view, how high do the numbers of non-citizens illegally voting or attempting to vote in our elections have to get in order for Congress to take action? Is there some kind of magic threshold?
There's no magic threshold, and I would note that we have done a series of hearings that have shown where non-citizens have voted in numbers that could have a significant impact or determinative impact on federal elections.
Yeah, I mean, the radicals in the New York City Council tried to pass a bill that would allow a separate set of books for non-federal elections versus federal elections, and it was struck down as unconstitutional in New York State courts under the New York State Constitution. But I agree with you. The acceptable threshold for non-citizen voting in our federal, our state, and our local elections should just be 0, period, end of story. This is a right and privilege of American citizens, and it should be protected as such. And Chairman Stile, isn't it true that we can't trust the Department of Justice to go after non-citizen voting or even to try to address the problem of non-citizen voting?
They've shown no prioritization of citizenship and non-citizenship voting.
And I think that should be incredibly troubling, given the fact that we have like 10 million people here illegally wandering around the country right now, all over the United States. It's a 50-state problem. It's especially a problem in my home state of New York, and I just boggles my mind that this isn't something that we can pass on a suspension to safeguard our votes for only citizens of the United States of America. But I completely agree with you. If the Biden White House isn't even willing to say that there's a problem, how can we trust the DOJ that they're even going to do anything about it? I strongly support this legislation before us today. It's a simple, straightforward measure that the vast majority, 3/4 in fact, of Americans support as well. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. I'll just say I went to the pharmacy to buy Sudafed the other day, and you know what? I left my wallet in my truck, and they had to go back and get it. You have to have an ID to even buy Sudafed in this country. I think that we need to have voter ID laws in this country, and I think that we need to be able to make sure that the person on the ID is constitutionally, legally the person they say they are and eligible to vote as a U.S. citizen. I think it should be limited to U.S. citizens. That's my opinion. Mr. Stile, you brought up the Georgia law. I'm from that great state. I listened to all the hee-hawing and everything else, and MLB moving, the game and everything else. And you know what happened after that law passed? The state of Georgia elected a Republican governor and a Democrat U.S. senator. And there were no questions about the integrity of the ballot after Georgia passed that law. And I supported that law, and one of the reasons I did is because there were over 1.2 million votes in the state of Georgia cast with no voter identification, none whatsoever. And if you look back at the historical numbers, the mail-in ballots, and I realize we had the COVID uptick, but mail-in ballots had typically been a very small total number, maybe 200,000 total for presidential elections. And in COVID, it went to over 1.2 million. I think my state legislature responded. And while Major League Baseball bought into all of the lies told about the law, ultimately the law elected a Republican governor that I voted for and a Democratic senator that I did not. And so I think this is a good law. I don't have any questions for, the author or the people that are presenting, and I look forward to voting for it on the floor.
Chair, thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. I want to thank our witnesses for the thoroughness with which they've approached this important issue, and the witnesses are excused. Thank you.